She put a hat on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country.
Indeed, telling about that life in the country, life in the villages, life in Guyana. Uh, Welcome to Anansi Web Education. My name is Mark Benchap, and you know how we do it here every Sunday evening, right here on 107.1 FM. Hope you've had a great weekend thus far. And as you prepare for a new week, new work week, usually it starts on Monday. Some people may have already started, but welcome to the show. With us, no stranger as always, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Otter Granger, is with us again this evening. How are you doing, sir?
Well, thank you for having me on the program. I'm doing great, and I look forward to this series. And I hope that our viewers find the RV series educational and entertaining. But as we move forward, as Guyanese, we want to make sure that the country is a better place for our children to grow up in. So I'm happy to be here.
Good to see you back again. Better place for our children, for everyone to grow up. And that cannot be the case unless they have a safe environment, a safe village, less violence. We can't just eradicate it totally, but violence in every form, including domestic violence, the killing of women, and all manner of things seem to be on the increase in Guyana. And this is something that we will be touching on today. In fact, we want to find out the causes, actually, as we look at some of the questions that we will be dealing with. What factors are responsible for the increase in violence against women, especially wives? Why have villages become the scene of so much domestic violence, especially murders? And the other one is we will deal with how can domestic violence in villages be prevented, and how can women be protected from violence? That's important. How can domestic violence in villages be prevented, and how can women be protected from violence? Interesting topic for this evening here. And we see the prevalence of domestic violence in Guyana. Some of the leading factors contributing to the prevalence of Guyana's domestic violence problem include alcoholism, societal norms, intergenerational violence, drug consumption, and child marriage. This was a report back in 2020, December 18th of 2020. Well, let's begin first with the question. What factors are responsible, Mr. Granger, you think, for the increase in violence against women, especially wives?
Thank you for that question. Although you've pointed out certain factors based on that report, I am of the view that the root cause is not alcoholism, or poverty. The root cause is the desire of one party, usually the male, to control the other party, that is the female. And you can see this happens in schools, it happens on the street, in gangs, it happens in politics. It's all a question of control. And people try to use violence to control the other the partner, whether it's spouse or the partner they're living with. And I think that has been a contributory factor. And we must bear in mind that society changes, it doesn't remain the same. And in the past, in the villages, there were certain controls, there were certain norms, there were certain conventions. And over a period of time, particularly over the last 60 years or so, some of those conventions have been dismantled. And as a result of that, you know, young people, young spouses do not get the type of advice, or they're not subject to the same, uh, you know, behavioral norms that people were subject to maybe 60 years ago. And this leads to an increase in violence. Once you do not encourage equality in relationships, there is going to be an imbalance, and there's going to be some attempt at domination. Alcoholism has existed before, drug use has existed before, poverty is always present. But I don't think that these are the deep-seated causes. The cause is the desire to control. And once you have a situation in which women are treated as unequal, or in any relationship, look at the gang. There's a gang leader who treats the younger members as unequal and subordinates. Look at what happened in the streets. And you must bear in mind that sometimes the way the police deal with the public, the way the police deal with squatters at Mocha Arcadia, the way they deal with, it's power play. They're not aiming at solutions, they're aiming at control. And as we saw in the last local government elections, it's all about control. It's not about, equality. It's not about shared, responsibilities for any community. It's all about control. So as long as the motivating factor is one of domination and control, I think there's going to be violence, especially against women, who unfortunately are regarded still as the weaker sex. Well, it's time we get over that historical description, and start treating people as equal.
The control factor has always been the case, whether in my time growing up in the 70s, in the 80s, the 90s, even prior to that, the controlling factor has always been there. And now we are seeing the prevalent of alcoholism. It's not that it wasn't there before, but based on my observations, is that it has increased, because never before have I seen, especially in the villages, I can speak of the villages, quarantine, that you see as soon as we say in Guyana, as soon as morning, bus. Lots of men and even young men are in these rum shops, drinking their little quarter bottle, drinking their little Guinness and all manner of things from 6 o'clock in the morning sometimes. I've never seen that during my time growing up in the 70s or 80s. And then even with the introduction of these hardcore drugs, I've never heard of these sort of drugs even as a little boy under quarantine. I mean, the only thing that I've heard of through the big older guys talk in the village is ganja, marijuana. That's all I've heard. But now you go into those same villages, all sort of drugs, alcohol every single day, night and day. You think because of that, things have really changed, and anger in some men and so forth? How much of a contributing factor is that?
It is relevant. I haven't dismissed it as a contributing factor, but what happens, I think, sometimes, and this is highly speculative, is that because of men's feeling of inadequacy, they pump themselves up with alcohol, which gives them false courage. This happens when you drive in a car. People who drive normally when they're sober, once they're filled with alcohol, they drive at excessive speed, they take risks. They feel bolder because they're intoxicated. And I think when a fisherman or a worker, gets drunk, he goes home. He feels that this is the way to dominate his spouse, because he has this, I think they call it Dutch courage, but it's a false courage, and he's uncontrollable. I think that is one factor. Um, so it is a question of insecurity. And of course, when a person takes, drugs or other psychotropic substances, it seems that he can walk on water, he can walk, and this of course leads to some deaths because they feel that they can do things which they wouldn't normally do. I don't disagree that alcohol is a factor, but the underlying factor is that they feel inadequate, they feel insecure,
What
and they
what
want.
what what about social media too, Mr. Granger, and movies and all these when I was growing up, again, I keep saying when I was growing up in the 70s, we had a radio. We didn't have TV until later down. But the soap operas and so forth, and the talking and these things, how much social media plays a role with the increase of domestic violence?
But all the media, uh, although they're meant to be entertaining, have hidden messages. And when a play or uh, some production is put is aired by males, they reflect the biases and prejudices of the authors or the script writers. And uh, when you have in the movies, for example, producers or directors who are males, they would give a complexion to the relations on the screen. This happens, or used to happen, in the earlier days, with race. I remember well into the 60s, if not much later, most times you see colored people, Africans, Chinese, or Indians, they're in subservient roles. They're sweepers and cleaners or servants or domestics. They're never managers. They're never in charge of anything because those films in those times were produced by whites, and the whites employed black servants or Indian servants or Latinos in subservient roles. So what we see in the social media, what we see in the movies, are products of human biases. And those biases for a long time were against women's equality. Those biases showed women in subordinate or subservient roles, and they were never shown as powerful women in boardrooms. They were never shown to be decision makers or managers. It's changing now, but you're quite right. The media are an important influence on the way women are portrayed. And if you belong to some cultural organization which does not tolerate equality, you'll find that the, the media would portray women in that subordinate role. And this would lead, it doesn't necessarily have to lead to violence, but it leads to the feeling of control. And once
Mhm.
that control once the woman resists, it is likely that control will be enforced by violent means.
You
That is the
know,
problem.
well said, Mr. Granger, and good evening to all of you who are now joining us. We have Shalon Washington, attorney at law, with us on the line. So we just wanted to get a quick question. We know you do a lot of divorce cases, Miss Washington, but what are some of the factors that lead up to divorce or divorces?
Some of the main factors that we notice very often is financial issues between the parties, infidelity very often, and a lot of times that infidelity would lead to some form of violence in the home, domestic violence, because once the spouse become involved with an outside person, some third party gets involved, he becomes disinterested in his home, in taking care of his home, and then the spouse and the children in the home are suffering, and then he takes out his frustration on the family, and that in a lot of instances ends up having a violent situation in the home, police being called, and what's not. But very often, yeah, those are the two major causes that leads up to divorce: financial issue and infidelity in the home, whether it be the infidelity on the part of the wife or the husband.
All right. What about domestic violence quickly when you were growing up? What was that like in Linden or even today?
Well, domestic violence is a big problem in Guyana. It's always been a big problem. I've seen it, when I was growing up as a child in Linden, because they weren't proper laws in place to protect the woman, and those laws, even if there were any, it failed. The system failed. Women and children, in particularly, were more vulnerable, because what you would see very often, if a husband and a wife are experiencing any form of dispute, rather than sitting and have a conversation, I think most of the times what end up happening is the husband use violence, and violence against his wife, violence against his children. In limited circumstances, I would have seen it the other way around, where the woman used violence against the man. But very prevalent in Linden, you would see a man beating his wife on the street, or dragging the wife out of the house and beating the wife. It was a lot of wife beating in Linden, and I don't think anyone was doing anything to educate people that when you have a dispute or a disagreement, the best way to solve that is through conversations. So a lot of educated people were around the environment where I grew up, so that was very prevalent. Wife beating and beating of your children mercilessly with objects, not just with your hand, but with objects, various objects, and using a machete and broadsiding your wife or your children. That was very frequent. Very often I saw that in Linden.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Ms. Washington. Hope to see you back soon right here on AWI. Appreciate your time, ma'am.
Thank you, Mark.
Good. Shalon Washington, dear, attorney at law. Mr. Granger, you heard some of the reasons people rush to get divorced and all manner of things. Your take on that before we move on to question number 2.
Ms. Washington is right to a point, but I do believe that some of the scenes that she described are related more to control. Now, I cannot speak for the situation in Linden, but I'm assuming that some of the spouses, some of the wives who were beaten, were housewives and were dependent financially on the male wage earner. And as a result of that, if he was displeased about anything in the home, something she did, she would be punished, and he would maybe beat her, take her out on the street. I mean, this is really serious, and unfortunately nowadays it leads to murder. But it's because of control, because he knows that he brings home the money, and she doesn't do the same, or she doesn't have equal status, and he uses violence to continue to control her. So I am not disputing what Ms. Washington said a few minutes ago, but what I'm saying, it reinforces my view that domestic violence is all about control. I pay the bills in this house, and this is how it's going to be, and if you don't like it, I'm going to beat the living daylights out of you. Well, if she was working for more than him, or if she is making an equal financial contribution to the house, well, that situation would probably come to an end very quick. She'd probably say, I'm out of this. But it's because he wants to control her that he probably uses violence as an instrument of control. So I don't disagree, but I'm just trying to elaborate on what Ms. Washington said.
Thank you so much. We move to the next question here, Mr. Granger. It has to do with why, and that's the why. It comes in to play here. Why have villages become the scene of so much domestic violence, especially murders? Why, sir?
Well, both of us and many viewers, I assume, come from villages. In fact, most Guyanese do come from villages. Um, uh, there were 200 Amerindian villages and over 100 African villages, and perhaps a similar number of villages which may be described as Indian. But demographically, most Guyanese still live in villages. Now, the villages are unique social groups. And very frequently, you go into a village that one family or maybe two or three families by name dominate. So once you hear about the person from Port Royal or Philippi or maybe even Karasabai, you would find that I can tell you, maybe Anai, there are dominant families, and once people are related, once they have these bonds of kinship, it is likely that disputes could be resolved consensually by the head of the family, by the patriarch, by the matriarch, and sometimes even the police, the priest, the schoolmaster would intervene to make sure that disputes don't get out of hand, don't become violent. No, what has been happening is that villages have been transformed gradually over the years. That many villagers have migrated. So sometimes the authority figures who were highly regarded have left the communities. For example, in the days of church schools, it is quite likely that the headmaster belonged to a dominant church in that community. For example, I went to something called the Auckland Church of Scotland School, and the headmaster was a Presbyterian who came from, an area close to Wim, and he was respected. Now, this is broken down. Sometimes the headmaster comes from miles away, and he doesn't have that same respect from the families or other people in the village. Policemen come from outside of the region. So the villages themselves have been changed, and they're no longer bound by kinship. They're now almost like business corporations. Schoolmaster comes from one place, the priest come from somewhere else, the police come from somewhere else, and uh, they're no longer rooted in the families in those communities. So that is one of the factors that the preventive mechanisms are no longer in place. Equally, um, the need for some of those persons who remain in the villages to control their spouses, maybe because of lower level of education. As you mentioned earlier, there might be a question of alcoholism. There might be other factors like unemployment, particularly coming at the time or after the pandemic when a lot of males were unemployed. Um, there was a surge of violence, and we can look at the figures um, up to COVID pandemic and look at the figures after COVID pandemic, and there is a surge um, that a lot of people who became unemployed or were not working started to maybe try to exert control over their families and over their spouses by violent means. In that way, villages cease to be little oases of tranquility and peace, and they started to become more violent. There have been social changes, there have been occupational changes, there have been changes in the way the villages have been administered, and the whole structure of neighborhood democratic councils. Um, when you were growing up a few short years ago, um, there were village leaders who were more or less respected in the villages, but now there's probably a situation in which your village is linked to a so-called NDC. The NDC doesn't have the moral character of the old-time villages. NDC is a governmental construct, which is probably controlled by a political party to which you don't belong. It's controlled by the RDC, which you don't belong. And many villages don't have the same relationship to the NDC that they had to traditional villages. So as a result of that, there has been, in my view, a loosening of the ties that bind. There has been a loosening of the relationship that one person had with uncle or auntie or cousin, um, uh, you know, with the church, with the parish, with the school. And as a result of that, I think it the door to violence has been opened, in that men who feel weak or insecure try to exert control, which they probably felt their father or grandfather exerted, without being questioned. So after the pandemic, particularly, men try to say, "Well, look, I'm in charge here." When in fact, they're not bringing in any money. The women have to go to work. They have to go to the market and sell, or they have to go and look for a job at some institution. The result is that the control mechanisms which existed maybe up to the middle of the last century have been loosened, and men are now trying to recapture that control, and they're using violence to recapture that control. That's my view.
All right. Thank you so much, President Granger. It's we're looking at the time, but we still have another question there to cover. Good evening to all of you who are now joining us. We have Ravina. Ravina is with us, and Ravina just wants to touch also on her take on the increase of domestic violence, men killing their wives, and so forth in Guyana. Ravina, good evening to you.
Good evening to all the listeners and viewers, and good evening to President Granger. My take on why there is so much domestic violence in Guyana, per se, there is a lack of education, educating men how to treat women right. Also, there's a lack of outsourced resources for women to go to when they have problems. There is not counseling in every region as to where people could go and get help when they deserve help. If they go to the local police, basically you're going to court and you're going back to the same situation. There should be a place, some sort of system put in place so women and men, both of them, could go and get help. There is not a system put in place, and this is because of lack of education, lack of upbringing, lack of morals in the home, lack of everything in Guyana per se. Everybody is just living a life that everybody wants to be the leader. You can only have one leader in a household, and when you have multiple leaders in a household, you have issues that you cannot debate properly, and people are not able to discuss situation because there is no counseling center put in place for anybody to go to and get actual help. And if they do go to a center, the issues or the matters comes back out in public. It's no confidentiality agreement with the clients and the person that's coming in to speak their problems. When they leave, their problems is all over on social media. So again, the privacy and the morals at the home, in the home, is not there. And upbringing of children today is very much so different than back in the days. Back in the days, we had culture, we had morals, we had ethics. Parents talk to kids, they just look at them and they would listen. Now, today, you cannot do that. So you have to be able to have a system in place where parents can able to talk to their kids. And if they can't be able to talk, there should be a system where they could go for help. But there is no such thing. And because of that, lack of education is causing a lot of suicide, and a lack of education is teaching men that, Guyana has always been a male chauvinist country where men controls everything and women are beneath. It should not be that way. It should actually empower women to be equal and able to communicate with men equal between each other. It should not be a way where men is only the one to have to say. And if a man hits a woman and he goes to the police or she goes to the police, he gets a few weeks or maybe he might get a fine, and that's about it. It should be a stiffer penalty for domestic violence situation. And it goes both ways for men and women, because there's some women that beat their husbands and some men that just brutalize their women. It should stop by getting people involved, the police, the community, the local NDCs should have centers in every region and every community should have an outreach program to facilitate domestic violence in the community.
Thank you.
That's all I have to say.
Good points,
Thank you.
Ravina. Appreciate it there. Yeah. Ravina Suklal with us there for a brief moment, sharing her thoughts or opinions on what should be done to curtail the widespread, the rampant domestic violent issues and the killing of women in Guyana. Mr. Granger, anything to add before we move on?
Well, I can I can not disagree with what she said. But education is important, enforcement is important. But the point I would like to make is that when you look at the country as a whole, you're looking at 10 administrative regions, you're looking at hundreds of villages. Um, they are educated people of every race. And when you look at nobody likes to get involved in racial analyses nowadays. But when you look at the murders, um, these are not murders committed by people who are poor or people who are drunk or people who are uneducated. So there's a problem of race. It's murders or domestic violence affects people of every race, both as assailants and victims. There's a problem of region. This happens all over the country. It happens in indigenous communities in the hinterland. It happens in coastal communities. It happens in rural communities. It's a question that is not unaffected by people who are of one religion or another. It's not a Christian problem, not a Hindu problem. So I do not believe that the answer we had just now explains the pervasive nature of domestic violence, particularly murder, across race, across religion, across geographic regions, and across social status. And sometimes, women of pretty, you may call middle class, or maybe I don't subscribe to much of class analysis of Guyana, but people who should know better, when they lose control of their families, they just punch their wives or punch their children. And that is the problem. It's not they're uneducated, it's not they're stupid. It's just that they want to assert control. And I, I take the point that Ravina made about enforcement. Some people are not afraid of the police. I mean, it's like murder. Christians may say that, the commandments prohibited killing, thousands of years ago, but people still kill. And similarly, you can say, thou shalt not kill, but they'll kill. You say, thou shalt not, commit domestic violence, but people still commit domestic violence. What I'm trying to say is that we need to examine causation in Guyana's situation. And here we have an absence of social cohesion. Here we have a situation in which women are not treated as equal, in which we feel that there is a license for the police to treat villagers in a domineering or dominant way. It can't work. The police are a problem, and then political parties are a problem in which they do not allow women equal voice in their parties and in parliament. And that is what the whole social cohesion movement from 2015 was all about. There must be an understanding of the need for equality. It is not an option. It is not something for this party to adopt or another party to adopt. It's not something that changes every time the political administration changes. Social cohesion is a necessity, and unless there's social cohesion, unless there's equality, there will always be domestic violence. And unfortunately, in Guyana, every week a woman gets killed because of the presence of domestic violence. And when the woman resists, somebody will cut her head off, and that is what has been happening. It's a tragedy. And don't forget that we have had two spells of civil violence in the 1960s and in the early 2000s under PPP administration. And they have an attitude to violence as a means of asserting political control, that has had very serious consequences for Guyana. And we must have governments which refuse to get involved in domestic solutions to political disputes. And this is what happened during the Troubles. Everyone knew there were massacres, and up to now, people have not forgotten or forgiven what happened in the massacres of 20 years ago. Similarly, in the disturbances, there are families who were badly hurt. What happened in the disturbances. And those two events are great tragedies, which are still reverberating in the domestic violence we have in Guyana, in the gangs, in the streets, in the schools, and in the homes. There is a need for measures to be taken to get away from this compulsion to control one another. And there must be some change towards treating one another as equals, regardless of race, religion, or region of residence.
All right, looking forward to the final question. But before we do, we have Ms. Brenda Casey with us to touch a little bit on domestic violence. Brenda Casey has been a teacher in New York City for many, many years, a professional. Ms. Casey, good evening. And
Good evening.
yes, we want to get your take on the prevalence of domestic violence in Guyana, and especially with the rampant killings of wives. What is your take on what's happening in Guyana with regards to domestic violence?
I believe the government of Guyana doesn't take the responsibility to protect families and the citizens. I believe there's not enough laws or policies in place for the protection of these families. And when you have a government that doesn't make that a policy where people are actually charged or matters taken into the hands of the police department to protect those families, they do whatever they want. When you have a government that's going to disrupt families by bulldozing and burning down their homes in ancestral lands, it poses a problem to those families because now there's conflict within the families, because now there's a situation that they have to deal with, and that could induce fights, arguments, killing, whatever, because people are just venting their anger on each other because the problem is beyond them and they don't know how to solve it. So women are abused because of these matters, because they're the ones most times are responsible for protecting their children. The man in many cases could walk away and decides he's not being a part of that family, but it's always the woman that is left with that responsibility. And if the government doesn't protect that female, then she's in trouble. It's like in the United States, I remember when women call the cop regarding any domestic violence, he is escorted away from her, and there are other agencies in place to protect her, even if it means removing her from the home with her children and taken to a safe place. But in Guyana, if the government doesn't care about its citizens and what they do, all it does is you have others mimicking the disrespect for women. When you hear of a government minister slapping a woman or spitting in her face and nothing is being done, or raping somebody's child and giving them money to protect that minister, it's a cesspool of a mess in Guyana. So we need to have laws to protect women. That's the beginning. And you should have the president's wife being involved in promoting a protection against women, but they're all silent, and silent means acceptance, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Brenda Casey. Appreciate your time, ma'am. Really do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Mr. Granger, before we move, and I know we've prolonged with this particular issue, it seems to be it is a very burning issue in Guyana right now, and hence it's okay we have gone over time. Any take on what Ms. Brenda Casey just added there?
She is not incorrect, because in all matters of public policy, the role of the government is important. And if the government demonstrates that this is not a priority area, it's a soft matter, um, they are more concerned with oil and gas, and rather than people's issues, uh, they are not going to put the in place. In fact, unfortunately, this administration started off by saying it has no use for social cohesion. Not only shut down the department, they shut down the policy. So there is actually nothing being done to bring about the conditions within the home or community to encourage equality and to reduce the need or the perception that men should control women. Um, this is quite different from what we tried to do between 2015 and 2020. So I don't disagree with Ms. Casey, but as I said, most issues come back to um, question of control, and control is based on equality. And once you have women and men on an equal footing, I think this thrust towards control, a desire of one to control the other, will be diminished. It's not happening now. And we need to look at measures other than enforcement. It's all well and good to call the police after, but calling the police doesn't prevent. And of course, Guyana doesn't have the types of resources that you may have in the typical New York precinct. You know, um, the, when you take away the man, you keep him in jail, and the woman, doesn't get money to run the house. And eventually he has to come back out. He's more angry than before. When you take the women, where is she going to go with her children? These are resources which perhaps a developed country has, but Guyana doesn't have. So we need to look at other measures to encourage equality and encourage cohesion, instead of pure enforcement. The police is what it is. We need to reform the police. We need to improve the quality of policing. But enforcement cannot prevent, on its own, enforcement cannot prevent, violence. And unfortunately, when violence becomes intense or extreme, it could lead to death. And when a country with our small population has a death rate of one per week, we are in trouble. And I think we need to look at measures which deal with human behavior, not just with punishment or enforcement of the law.
All right. Thank you so much, dear Brenda Casey. Thank you, Mr. Granger. As we move on to this final question here this evening, and it has to do with how can domestic violence in villages be prevented? And how can women be protected from violence?
The question concerns the village. And in Guyana, the village enjoys and occupies almost a sacred place, like a mythological place, because all of the Amerindians, Africans, and Indians eventually came from villages. And our relations, the majority of Guyanese still live in villages. And we're all concerned about aunties and uncles and cousins who come from villages. And it is a tragedy that there should be any murder or any violence of this nature in villages. To the extent that some of the contributors who have been invited to come on this program are concerned about corrective measures, there is something called community policing. If they feel that policing is part of the solution, let us have village-based community policing, and let us have village-based neighborhood policing. Now, why I emphasize community policing? Because my concept is different from what is practiced in Guyana now. this doesn't mean giving people SUVs with buttons and handcuffs going around the country at night. What it involves is that the divisional commander, the police district command, must sit down with the village leaders, with the NDCs, with the NGOs such as the churches and business groups, and work out how the villages could be protected. You have sometimes vulnerable persons like widows, or very small children who live in these communities. How could they be protected from violence? And this is not something to call in, the police commissioner about. This is something that must take place at village level. So I would like to see a relationship between CPGs, community policing, and the neighborhood policing in the villages, in the neighborhoods, so that when there is a problem or when a problem is brewing, because violence doesn't take place suddenly, there are certain antecedents, and you can see that they're shouting, people are hearing songs of, or there is some indication that violence is going to take place. People could be called in before. That is what they regard as prevention, particularly for women. And after a while, the police inspectors would get to know who are vulnerable in their communities. And the patrols, the discussions, the communication will be directed to ensuring that those women are protected. And this is what I see happening. If you look at policing, I don't believe policing is the only answer. But neighborhood and community policing must be changed from what it is now. You see there's some, maybe some visitor by a dignitary, and you see all these neighborhood police suddenly turn out. Their business is in the village, speaking to the widows, speaking to the schools, speaking to the children. I was amused a few weeks ago when there was some gang violence on the East Coast. You saw half a dozen police, looking as if they're posing for some family photograph. They turn up at the school, and in 30 minutes, they deliver a talk, and then they go back to the station. That's not policing. It's a sort of lecture series. But what we need is that within that neighborhood, there should be a real relationship between the police division and the citizens. This is what we attempted to do when we broke down the police division structure to make sure that every region had its own commander. That regional commander for Region 6 or Region 5 or 4, 3, 2, 1, whatever it is, must get into the communities and deal with the persons living in those communities and find out who is vulnerable, who is weak, who is the bully, who is capable of violence. And in that way, they could not only do preventive work, but they could do protective work. So when there is some indication that there's going to be violence, they're there first. And, that is how it has to work. But the relationship between the police and the community must be such that, there is more involvement of the divisional commanders with the communities, with the neighborhoods. And that is the way that the villages, there are more villages than towns in this country. There are only 10 towns, but there are, 300 villages, and that is the way it has to work. Policing has to be more granular in the sense that it must deal with the places where people live. They mustn't just deal with conferences and visits by VIPs.
All right. Thank you all so much this evening. We went way over time, but that's okay. It's for a good reason, good cause. Policing must improve. Villages must be respected. Domestic problems, violence, and all these things must be properly addressed. They cannot just be addressed with one a conference held on a weekend or whatever for food and drinks. It's much more than that. And so tonight's topic we've had, in terms of domestic violence, we've had attorney at law Shalon Washington with us. We've had Ravina with us as well. And we've also had Brenda Casey, former school teacher in New York City. Brenda Casey with us as well. And for now, we'll just pull the curtains down, but just as a reminder, some of the things that we've dealt with today had to do with the domestic violence and wife murders are a plague on society. What the United Nations General declared, Secretary General declared, violence against women and girls may be the world's longest and deadliest pandemic. It's got to stop at some point in time. But all of us have to play that role, including those who are in government and those who are law enforcement officers in the villages, in the communities. Mr. Granger, thank you so much for your time. God bless you, and give my regards
to this program.
Yeah. Give my regards to your better half.
Certainly will.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. God bless you. And to all of you guys again, thank you so much. And we will see you guys next week. Same place, same time, right here on this little village called Anansi Web Education. So long now.
She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Crow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Crow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Crow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back down, me now a come home. In a